Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, the middle of Iowa, the middle of Two Rivers, the Raccoon and the Des Moines, right in the middle of your listening habits. Thank you for being a part of the Uncommon Good. My name, Bo Bonner. I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Bud, what do you do at the same place?
I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences.
Absolutely, and we both want to say thank you to Mercy College of Health Sciences for underwriting our show, mchs.edu. We are in the middle of summer semester. One of the things I don't know if it's completely unique, but certainly unique enough, is to get you out there and in the health sciences workforce. We are an all-year operation, Bud. We have people who get to do our programs at an accelerated pace is the right word, I guess. And so it is completely possible for you to come in and what's the minimum, Bud, to get out as a nurse? It's 3 semesters, which would be how many months?
Well, it's 1 calendar year.
It's 1 complete calendar year.
You have to have a bachelor's degree or a lot of credits in place, but you can finish a nursing degree in a year.
So we are the place you want to go look at if your idea is you see the need, you want to extend that healing ministry of the Sisters of Mercy who founded Mercy College, and you want to get out there. For some folks, within a year, mchs.edu is the place that you want to check out.
Well, another great thing about Mercy College of Health Sciences that I'm really proud of is we're downtown Des Moines. We're in the heart of it all.
In the middle of everything.
Yeah.
I was going to say the bleeding heart, the pulsing heart of the city. So you want to do a checkup on how the city's doing. You just put the stethoscope right up on our building.
What's the difference between pulsing and pulsating?
I don't know. Well, now
I thought you were going to say pulsating, but I think pulse works. I know there's a pro-life group in the city called Pulse, and I think that's what they're going for.
It's true. So pulsating is like sort of just the act of like a thing, like your heart moving back and forth, right? But pulsing, right, is the liquid flowing through. I think it's right to talk about both. So your heart pulsates, its muscles, and it's pulsing blood. Maybe it itself isn't pulsing, but it's pulsing blood throughout your system. Or, Bud, I've made up a word, which is totally possible.
You know, another muse that I have at the start of the show is when you, I know we've been doing the show for like 8 years, almost a decade now, rounding up. Whenever you say, this is the Uncommon Good, the Uncommon Good is on the air and you say it with such enthusiasm. I always get in my mind the Ron Paul meme where it's like, it's happening. It's funny that happens every week. Like usually that meme is used for sort of an extraordinary event that everyone was anticipating or something. But for me, it's the show.
Do you know what I actually do that for, right? Like that's an homage. So Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, who are the founders of Western Swing, when they would start their shows or their recordings, they'd go, the Texas Playboys are on the air. And so I'm imitating them doing that. And that's sort of a shout out to my granddad, my mom's dad, Oscar Gibson, because he's the one who introduced me to Bob Wills. And so that's my understated way to tip my hat to Bob Wills, but also to my granddad.
That's pretty cool.
But Ron Paul's cool too, I suppose.
Well, what's weird about radio though is like you're on the air, and once you go on the air, there's a red light. Mm-hmm. And I think the red light is to keep people out of the room because it's like, hey, we're recording, stop. You know, like don't disturb. But it throws me off because I'm thinking like red light, green light.
Oh.
So do I start or stop talking when the red light comes on?
See, I thought you were going to go with Big Red because of your Nebraska ties. But what sci-fi nerd went to is I was thinking of the red light in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I can't do that, Hal. Or no, I can't do that, Dave. It's Hal. Hal's the name of the robot.
I'll start thinking Big Red when I see that light.
Well, the point that we're getting at is unlike... You know what? This is thematic, but I'm going to be honest. This was one of our weaker show openings. However, we're going to talk about the very Christian, Pauline particularly, principle of finding strength and weakness. I think we're going to find the strength of this opening But we'll do it right after this. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Whether you're listening to us through the airwaves on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or our beautiful, wonderful, intelligent podcast listeners. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I suppose people might remember the day. It wasn't that long ago, 2 years ago, I think. We used to be a 30-minute show. Before that, we were an hour show. We're back to an hour show. But when we were on the 30-minute show, we dedicated what ended up being like a whole year. And I counted this out because there was someone who wanted to hear the shows. I believe it was 37 or 38 episodes where we talked about leadership in a new key. Sacrificial leadership, or we called it kenotic leadership, right? Like kenosis, the self-emptying, the pouring out, being like Jesus in Philippians chapter 2. And so, yes, I know there's specific people who are staring daggers at both of us through the airwaves to tell us to just go write a book about it. However, I'm glad, praise the Lord, that we've taken our time to sort of let some of these ideas percolate a bit. And also, I would say in 2 years' time, we've had to lead people to get a paycheck, both you and I, a lot more than 2 years ago. And boy, howdy, I don't think there's anything I would change, but there's certainly things I would add from experience. Well, one of those is, I know we brought this up when we talked about Paul. We had to have. But I think it's only become more and more clear that one of the leadership principles, if we're going to imitate Jesus and be willing to pour ourselves out like he did, use our strength for the sake of other people's weaknesses, we have to consider the inverse, which is the very Pauline idea that God uses our weakness as a strength. Now, there's ways in which, Jesus himself talks this way as well, but this is a repeating theme throughout all of Scripture, the sort of idea that the foolishness of God is better than the wisdom of men. A lot of it, Bud, probably able to be written off as poetic, not like flowery or that we can ignore it, but a lot of it is sort of paradoxical and sort of something to bring to your spiritual life and to ask what that means. Today, I'm hoping that we can really sort of say, how do you operate that if you're going to be a leader where you're honestly going to say, I am going to use my weaknesses as a strength? Because what that can't be, I think of this as, how many times have you had to take the different strength finder type tests? Yeah. What certainly I don't think St. Paul is saying is like, what Christians do, instead of finding like that Bo actually is good with people, we're going to make him sit indoors and like be an accountant because weakness is strength. That certainly can't be what they're saying. The idea is not go find what you're the worst at and make your life miserable. So I really want us to sort of chew on this, if you don't mind, today, and think about what does it mean to say you start to use your weakness as a strength. We have a common video that actually I would send people to, but before we get there, first thoughts, Bud, of me throwing this one on you, 30 minutes before the show instead of my customary 5 minutes before.
Yeah, you mentioned it as a theme throughout Scripture, and I think that's certainly the case. So many examples in the Old Testament. One of the most prominent ones is Moses, because God chooses Moses to be a spokesman to the Pharaoh and to ask or to demand from the Pharaoh that God's people be set free. And Moses in Scripture, right, has a speech impediment, or he says, I'm not a great speaker. And God gives him Aaron as a support. But the point being, Moses being one of the least likely figures who would be called to serve this prophetic role and write down so much of like the commands that God has given to us, given kind of his natural proclivities. You see it in God often carries the line, like the covenant line, through women who are naturally barren. And then when kings and prophets are chosen, like famously David, I think the prophet, is it Samuel by that point?
Yep.
He goes through like all of the sons before he gets to lowly David, or younger David, I should say.
Yeah, that they didn't even bring in from the field.
Yep. So, this is definitely a theme I've puzzled over, and it sounds like you have some thoughts for us today about why that's the case. There's the poetic element that you spoke of. Certainly, I think it's to display, you could say, like the glory or the providence of God, that this is not the great work of salvation history is not a human achievement, but it's a providential ordering of things.
Yeah, grace. Yep.
And then finally, for someone like King Saul, who does fit the bill of the sort of stereotypical king, it's his pride or his hubris who brings him down. So often those natural strengths give human beings like a false sense of their own self-sustaining powers.
So I believe fundamentally, I think that that's the number one correct answer, is to say God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the strong and show that precisely their own self-reliance is what, I mean, the misunderstanding and the willfulness to depend on oneself from the devil onward, right, is the main tripping block. What I think is interesting, though, is if we took that in an overly wooden way, I'll be serious. It seems like we bring students to Christian and Catholic colleges. We ask them to be Catholic leaders. We want them to imitate Jesus Christ. But, Jesus's weaknesses were all self-chosen. So already that's sort of a different sort of thing. Like, Jesus Christ is supremely powerful, chooses to limit himself. He chooses all sorts of people, and it is precisely the case that they wouldn't necessarily fit the bill, right? So famously, people can talk about Peter, who's the first pope, not just shining off the page as someone who's like, well, he'll be great at organizing the first group of believers. Paul, famously killing all of these Christians, not necessarily your first choice for the apostle to the Gentiles who shows God's love for them. But what I will say is, I don't think what God's saying is, and I don't think it proves out that what God is saying is that the people have clear strengths, they should completely ignore them, and then they should do things they're bad at. So, David isn't bad at ruling. People he has mistakes, of course, but it's not that he's bad at ruling, it's that people have a bad understanding of what rulers should be like. Yeah. Saul, who becomes Paul, it's exactly that same zeal that made him, persecute Christ, that made him leave everything for the sake of Christ. And in some ways, it's even Peter's ability to sort of be amazed that makes him look so, I don't know the right word, like dumbfounded and like lack of words before Pentecost, that then makes him the sort of leader of the first Christians. So we can't be overly wooden about this idea that what it means is you should do a strength test, and your 100th worst trait, that's what you should pursue. But on the other hand, Bud, I do think we fall into this where we get into leadership studies mode in the church, and we sort of go quite against the meaning of what's going on here. So we will go, oh, that person, that kid, that guy, that gal, they're really busy and into all of the activities, and they've really showed themselves to be a great leader. And to me, you start to go, that looks a lot like what anyone would think would be a civic leader. So what are we starting to miss here?
Yeah, I think the word strength has different senses to it, or different meanings. And this doesn't capture the totality of what you're saying, but there is a way where we can talk about strengths and weaknesses as like personal characteristics. Mm-hmm. There's also a way that the form that God uses, or the shape that God uses to bring about certain things, is seen as weakness in the eyes of the world. So what I have in mind is, in the Old Testament, Israel often stumbles because it trusts in its own military prowess rather than trying to rely on God's promises. Right. And so famously you have verses like, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord. And that's supposed to be this like clarion call. Like the other kings and nations, they'll do their censuses and they'll count all their people, and they'll build up their militaries. But like God will intervene on behalf of his people, and to turn to those sort of other things is a sign of doubt or lack of faith. That bleeds into the New Testament, where I'm cribbing some from Stanley Hauerwas, our professor in graduate school, who said, the problem with the weapons of this world is not that they're too strong, but that they're not strong enough. And right. He would point to examples like, I've shared this in class with students, the civil rights movement. Like, you take a time machine back to the South in 1955 or whatever. And, you've got Klan members using terrorist tactics to try to scare the African American community into any sort
and
of.
We're part of the government. 1955 looks absolutely hopeless in one lens.
And they had all the levers of power. And so it would have been tempting for the civil rights leaders to resort to some form of violence. And in certain cases, it's complicated, but you had a leader like Malcolm X who said by any means necessary. But others, we've all heard the life of MLK, chose a different path. And they said the resistance that we want to build isn't lying over, but it doesn't embrace this kind of peaceable way of change. And it's often those social movements that have the longest lasting effects in a society. And so the sort of path that Christ, the vision that he cast for us, the way of the cross, it's kind of this leaven within society that brings about greater change. But at the time, people see it and they look at it just as a form of weakness.
So this reminds me of Christ maybe saying the most pointed rejoinder that bears this out. So Pilate is sort of trying to say, I'm part of Rome. I can kill you or I can save you. Why don't you speak? And Jesus goes, don't you know that I could call legions of angels at my side if that was the will of God? So in a war match, God could, Jesus could at his will call sufficient enough angels to defeat the Roman army. That's what's being pointed out. But there's something more powerful than the power of man. There's something more powerful than the Roman legion. And that power looks like and is experienced as the weakness of the torture and death on the cross. But by doing that, Christ's true strength comes forth, and he defeats death with death itself, a power that nothing else on this earth has any comparison to. And so it's not that what we're saying is, okay, find what you are bad at and then get a job that's all you do and suffer the rest of your life. What we are saying, though, is if you're honest about what you're weak at, what's interesting is that God often takes that weakness in order to make a strength you would never have except for that you have that weakness. So I want to give a very practical example. One of my favorite New York Times did a video series on this. This is an 8-minute video. It's called I Have Face Blindness. This is how I recognize you. When you can't rely on facial recognition, you look beyond the obvious, by James Robinson. It is about a man named Paul Cram, who has a condition called prosopagnosia. I think I've said it right. Face blindness. So it's a neurological disorder where you literally cannot recognize people's faces. It's a spectrum, so some people have it a little bit, like famously Brad Pitt actually has this as well. But this guy has it severely. He goes, I can talk to a person, someone that I know, and when I walk away, it's like their face disappears. What's interesting is this is not, this guy's not like a hermit who never goes out. He actually has an incredible social life. He actually flies glider planes, which is something that demands, I didn't know this part about glider planes, but it demands a ton of social interaction and sort of, you have to rely on a lot of people. It's very dangerous if you don't have a sort of good network to do it. And so you go, well, how does this guy who can't recognize faces remember people? And this video goes through and talks about how because of this deficit in his life, he was forced to really think about, how am I going to remember people? And what he remembered them from is this dense web of social relations, right? Oh, you're this person, you do this thing, you know these people, this is why we know each other. And so people who don't suffer from face blindness, they go, yeah, when I'm having trouble remembering people, I go talk to him because his weakness of facial blindness makes him aware to the dense social fabric that is every human that we who don't have facial blindness take for granted. And Bud, to me, this is sort of a living biological example of finding strength and weakness.
Yeah, there are a lot of individuals with a whole range of natural strengths, but there might be a weakness that makes them, in a sense, more hyper-aware of a part of reality. I think about conversations with our students where so many of them, they felt called into the medical field because of a childhood illness or because they lost a loved one. Even students who were sometimes like slowed down in a certain way, and then they find a unique niche. Like sometimes like if someone's slower moving, they might be called to like gerontology. They're not going to be in the emergency room or the ICU, but they have this kind of like awareness of those needs and are able to meet those.
And so I think when we talk about in leadership and we're asking people, what does it look like? What should be a Christian difference of forming leaders? It's easy to think about positives, strengths, and like big hopes. And we do this a lot with our young people. We go, hey, if everything works out and everything goes to plan, what do you want to be? What do you want to excel at? And what do you want to really shine forth? They're like, well, I think I'm this sort of person. I can live this sort of way. I'm good at these sort of things. And if everything works out, blammo, that's what I'm going to do. And I know we've talked about this, where this is bringing up Nassim Nicholas Taleb and his idea of anti-fragility. But I think, Bud, we don't do right by our students if we go, if everything works out, what do you want to do? I think it makes sense to go, hey, if, what's an ideal of what you think you can do? And what do you think is preventing you from getting there? That's interesting information to ask. But I think the real thing, all of us who have lived a bit of life, is to say nothing ever goes to plan. I mean, a little, but I mean, the big victories in our life when things actually went how you planned are rare enough that we throw ticker tape parades about it. You think about a sports metaphor. How many football teams are there in the pros? It's like 30 something.
Yeah, it's close to 30.
Yeah. So all of those except one have their season go to plan. And we're happy for that one team. And there'll actually be people who lose and we go, hey, they did a pretty good job losing and not going to plan. How often are we shortchanging our young people by asking them, what difficulties, what struggles actually do you could go through and benefit from? Because certainly there are struggles, and this is different from person to person. There's some struggles that would destroy anyone. I'm not denying that. You fall out of an airplane, it's bad news. But there's also all sorts of struggles that some people would handle better than others, and you have to start to ask them, what struggles or difficulties actually, if you went through those, would you be able to benefit from growing through them as opposed to others? How many times have we ever asked someone that, but to ask what sort of difficulties would you actually become stronger from, rather than only saying if everything went to everything went to plan, that you would benefit from it?
Well, that's kind of what I'm wrestling with as I hear you talk, because I really like this idea, and I think there are a lot of examples. You mentioned the author Taleb, and he tells this whole funny story of like severely injuring his nose. Does he break his nose?
Yeah.
And he goes to the doctor, and the doctors normally have like some antibiotics that they'll give for the possibility of infection. And Taleb says like,
"Oh no, it's just to correct you a bit.
Yeah,
it's ibuprofen.
Oh, for the pain,
for the swelling.
Okay. So
they're like, oh, we're going to give you ibuprofen for the pain and the swelling, and then he asks,
like, is it absolutely necessary for me to have these meds? Because he wants his body to develop the capacity to heal itself if that's a natural process.
And so they look at him like he's a complete weirdo, but they're like, if you can breathe out of your nose, it's fine.
Yeah.
And so he says no, and he goes, I looked funny for a while, but to your point.
And similarly, a little bit different, like I think about the life of Michael Jordan, funny enough, where he was cut from the basketball team like his freshman year, like his first year of high school or something, or at some point he didn't make a team. And everyone's like, oh, Michael Jordan was cut. But that's sort of like the impetus for him developing these new skills. And I'm going to like use my left hand more so that I can, compete, et cetera, et cetera. But Bo, like those are great examples and sort of like amazing stories. But how do we lead people to that point? Because it's almost like, do we develop an octagon or some sort of like virtual reality chamber? Life has a way of like bringing us to those struggles, but maybe our existence is too cushy. Like many of us just don't encounter that.
Well, on that even too, I think sometimes there is people have probably heard the term LARPing, live action role playing, where people who live very easy lives go, well, I'm going to go make my life hard for a weekend. I actually think, so I've thought of this problem before too, because Aristotle goes, okay, how do you become virtuous? We have to get in the habit of doing so. So what do you do when your life doesn't involve a lot of natural bravery, for instance. And you go, well, a kid, there's something, it was brave that you told the truth when you didn't have to or something like that. But certainly it seems we don't want to go like, well, we're going to drop Jimmy in the forest at 4, and if he makes it out, he's brave. So when we get back from this break, I want to get back to that topic because I think I have something interesting to throw out there, and that will lead us to exactly like you're saying is, so if this is all true, how will Catholics develop their young as leaders differently than the rest of the world? This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, we've been talking about weakness as strength, the sort of St. Paul, the whole Bible, but St. Paul really strictly pointing that out, right? What does he goes?
My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.
There you go. And one of my weaknesses is butchering quotes, and one of your strengths is actually I've already looking it up, so thank you. So we've been talking about this, is what does that mean if we're going to have that be the flagship for Catholic leadership formation, especially in the young? We've pointed out in the first segment that it really doesn't seem what God's trying to say is, so choose what you're the worst at, the worst skill you have, and then work 40 years and be miserable and, ruin a bunch of companies or institutions. But certainly we, as a church, have not done a good job of actually telling the young, consider what you aren't powerful at. Consider a weakness you have, and not that that should be what you lead with. Of course, we want to use your skills. Obviously, God uses the different skills that the apostles have, but he also uniquely figures out how to use the weaknesses people have in order to have a strength come from them. It's a resurrection principle, right? Jesus Christ used death to defeat death. He's going to use our weaknesses to have the sort of strength that overcomes what we think those weaknesses will prevent us from doing. So, Bud, we were ending the segment talking about it was precisely certain struggles in life sometimes that made people really redouble their efforts and become great at what they were going to do. So you brought up Michael Jordan gets cut from a team. That's an impetus that makes him say, oh, I'm going to take this difficulty and I'm going to use it to become a strength. And so we ended it by asking, so does that mean that our lives are too cushy and we just need to make life hard for ourselves? Yeah. I think that the notion of raising children is a big one here. Certainly you want children to be able to have the ability to fail so they can pick themselves up and try again. We learn from our mistakes, all of those things. But when it comes to the big virtues, I brought up courage or bravery. I think there's been, through human life, probably a lot of children had to be learned, to be brave because of natural circumstances. But of course, every parent doesn't want their kid to have life and death situations consistently. Somehow we want them to learn to be courageous, but not have to, make it out of as a captive in a foreign prison or something like this. So what I actually posit is this is where I think Aristotle talks about poetics and literature. So, of course, virtue is about an appropriate response to passions. Roughly emotions, but passions, right? So fear is a natural passion. Fear is what makes us avoid things, right? It's good. It's not bad to have fear. Fear is bad when either it overdrives us, so we become cowards and we don't do what we need to do in light of that fear, or when we don't feel it enough and we become foolhardy and stupid and do things that we shouldn't be, that fear would prompt us not to do. So virtue is a mean between two extremes, and it's about a passion. And so, sure, your kid is always going to have small steps towards courage. Try to take that bicycle ride. Try to speak up in class when you don't want to. But the big sort of, courage, that's what I think literature and art is about, right? We put ourselves in the place of people who are going through moments where fear is great and they have to act courageously. And we sort of practice, at least our reaction to the passions involved in virtue, by encountering great art. I actually think this is where great art does play a role in moral formation. Most people act like you read something like the Iliad or the Odyssey, and you're getting, descriptions of the moral life, which is insane because, like, you should not be basically like any of those characters. They're at least problematic, to say the least. However, to put yourself in their place and to imaginatively face their fears and imaginatively think about how to respond virtuously in courage, that is something that aids in moral formation. But I think that does start to speak to this idea of allowing our weakness to be an occasion for a future strength.
Yeah, I think another piece of that is awakening our kids' eyes to the reality of this communal good. And this came up for me. I thought about this when you were mentioning the facial recognition case, where it sounds like a part of that man's strength is that he developed, like you said, a social network, and this like a kind of like a community within a community that compensated for his weaknesses. That's such a key part of human existence. We in our servant leadership course with students, we kind of joke, especially if it's like a spring version of the course, about a bracket, like, bracketology with the NCAA tournament, where you face off like different animals during their youngest stages. Like you've got a bear cub, a puppy, and we throw in a human baby and we say, like, if this was a battle royale, like which one wins the bracket? And of course, like the human infant would not.
Even if it was a survival one, even if they don't have to fight each other, like
just leave them out in the woods.
What animal as a child would you leave out in the woods and expect to live? And humans, very low on the list. So how are we on the top of the food chain?
Yeah. And human beings, like we develop far more slowly than many mammals or whatnot. But because of that reality, it created a culture. Humans created cultures where it's like that dependency. We developed all sorts of ways of like rearing our children and bring them up to full maturity. And that, in a sense, like it created a context in which like what was seen as a weakness, this like slow development, very fragile existence during the earlier stages, where we became, like you said, the top of the food chain, sort of like, we've usurped the dinosaurs.
That's right.
As like the rulers of the jungle.
Yeah, and precisely because that weakness demanded us to be around each other, we became a communal animal, and it demanded language, right? The only way humans were able to sort of make their way in a world very much set against them, like you said, the odds, was this revolution that was communication. Not even communication. I mean, animals communicate. Language. Language was the strength brought about because of our weakness. And because of language, I mean, that's the reason that all animals reasonably fear us now all goes back to language being the thing that sprung out of our weakness.
But we forget that at our own peril. Like, none of us is really self-reliant. We may tell ourselves that fable. Like, there's all sorts of ways, and like our entire society is a network of dependencies. But like we can kind of get into that habit. And I think part of it is not seeing our weaknesses as a strength and then lying to ourselves about how strong we really are. Where the sign of a society that's truly like in free fall, that's like imploding in on itself, is how it treats its most vulnerable members, where it's like all of a sudden like those with any sort of physical handicap or the elderly or the infirm, like they're seen only as like a burden or a weight upon society. And once that starts happening, you really get in a cycle of like humanity, in a sense, like turning in on itself.
No, and what's funny about this, to go philosophical, is Nietzsche, famously, God is dead, Nietzsche, all of these things. His most sophisticated argument that if you leave it as is, seems to have a point, is he goes, oh, what Christianity did is it made the masses resentful of the powerful. And so he imagines what Christianity is this big invention of this story where there's this God that sides actually with the losers, and the losers are just hanging on and holding back the greatest. What's funny, and the Catholic claim against this, is it's these so-called strong people who resent the poor and the weak and the vulnerable precisely because they are resenting the source of what makes us strong in the first place. But this goes back to the LARPing, and I do think you're right. Like, if we put our children in a bubble and we never let them make mistakes, I mean, that to me alone, you have to make a classroom where you encourage kids to make mistakes, because mistakes are what make us better. That's the anti-fragile point. But when people get into this LARPing mode about like, you need to be strong and tough and you need to go pretend like you're some sort of survivalist, even though you're going to go home to an air-conditioned house, all of that sort of stuff, what they miss the point of is precisely what you're saying. They are buying into this myth that they themselves will become strong if they just put themselves to the test and get there and get there and get there. But even when you talk about the brilliance of, past ages where you have warriors that win at war and seemingly it's them going through strife and turmoil that makes them great, you might have a single great warrior, but who do people actually fear? And it's the legions, it's the Comanche raiding parties, it's the Mongolian horde, but it's people who are honest about their strength as a community and that they took some former weakness and addressed it together. Yeah. And so the strong man, you notice that Nietzsche always has this Ubermensch, right? It's this one strong person, is resentful of the vulnerable because it's actually the vulnerable that brings us together and makes us the most strong. The strongest societies, as you said, figure out ways to care for the weakness, and in doing so, become stronger. You do that yourself in the interior life, bud. If we would think about it that way, this is where I think we have to start talking to our children and what we get wrong in leadership studies. If you addressed a part of your life that you know is a weakness as a vulnerable member of your own interior life family, rather than something you should cut off or ignore or despise, how much different would we treat ourselves, bud? And I think that has to be the question we ask is, okay, you are weak at this skill or this aspect of life, but instead of hating it or running from it or trying to just overshadow it with a strength, what is a way that if you dealt with it like a vulnerable member of society, that you would become stronger like a city that comes together to care for its vulnerable?
It's fascinating because these themes are all woven throughout literature and films, but we kind of miss them in real life. Like I think about how many films, weirdly, the one that comes to mind for me is M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. But there's oftentimes a blind character who sees things that others don't see. Absolutely. A recently resurrected sort of like novel in a way, the Lord of the Rings by J.R. Tolkien. Like at the center of that plot is these humble, what are they called? Hobbits. Yeah. I had a brain freeze. Yeah. Hobbits who, like, the rest of the world is maybe like focused on the great battles, these epic battles that are taking place, but it's this really sort of like precarious journey of the hobbits carrying the ring to Mount Doom, that to Mordor, that brings about like the restoration of all things. So it's woven all through. And then on the flip side, you can look at history where we forget this and we kind of go our own right way and we're going to figure it out. We're going to solve the problem. To stick with the movie themes, I recently watched Oppenheimer, the Christopher Nolan film. It's like we built this amazing weapon, more powerful than anything that humanity has ever constructed. And oddly enough, what was supposed to provide peace, like, puts us on the brink of like
total annihilation.
Total annihilation, our own self-destruction. And so we have to kind of like, sometimes, like I said, it's the novelists and the filmmakers who pick up on this. As Christians, we have to begin to see this and lean into it in our everyday lives. And that's where, we're getting near the end of the show, but I can imagine sort of like a Eucharistic angle to this whole thing, because the formation, like how we, so to speak, like get into shape spiritually is through this, through a sacrifice, but also a meal and gathering around a table and like the broken body of a risen Lord who was executed. Like that's a completely different sort of like way of organizing your life than so often like the communities of the world do it.
Well, I think this is where actually complementarity comes in a way that I hope would prevent how it's often abused. So complementarity, especially when it gets into sort of gender roles and sort of that culture war idea, it can become a dirty word because it's basically like, oh, well, God from the beginning of time made a puzzle piece, and there's one puzzle piece and another, and you better be the puzzle piece or otherwise you won't connect with anyone. So it's obviously the case that throughout history, through Christian theology, the idea of the complementarity, right, is that there's things men do better than women on the whole, and then similarly, the complementarity way with women for men. And I understand that that's a very controversial thing to say even in 2024, But what I want to say is there's a complementarity aspect to all of this. That's not just like, oh, we only think of that in terms of gender. For us, right, the idea is like, well, that pervades all that we do. What you will undoubtedly be strong in, someone else is weak in, and God has made you strong for the sake of that person's weakness. And conversely, you must admit there is some weakness you have that you will not be able to overcome except for the complementarity of others. And so complementarity stops being like, well, God had this big plan and you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4 the other. And, and we can beforehand say, obviously, what this looks like throughout all of history. Yeah. And instead, what it goes is, of course, when God created the means of human generation, he would thread complementarity into it. Of course he would. When hasn't he done that? Even the sort of creature and creator role, it's sort of like the most far apart complementarity, right? Like, in fact, there's no analog. God doesn't need us except that he's freely loved us into existence, though that we can love him back. But the point that I'm getting at is there is no sort of alone monad anywhere in the universe. Yeah. And so this complementarity, of course, it's going to be, yes, between men and women, but it's also going to be in show hosts, bud. I hope people think that we have a complementary style, and that's the reason that the show works. It's certainly the case when we teach, and it can go on and on and on, right? It's not just, oh, you say tomato and I say tomato. It's what I have as a weakness, you have as strength, and vice versa, and that makes a more complete whole than just filling in gaps.
Yeah, I feel like there's really a Pauline theme to this entire show. And when you were making that last point, I couldn't help but think about when he talks about the body of Christ. Mm-hmm. It's one body made up of many parts. And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, and vice versa. And Paul gets into the idea of weakness again, because he says, we give the weakest members of the body the greater dignity or whatnot. But they all hang together as a whole. And even those parts of the body, like the eye has extraordinary power. Like it can see the objects of our world, like from a long distance or whatever. But like the foot, we kind of like put a sock around it and cover it in shoes, and it's at the lower part of the body. But if you've ever had like serious foot pain, you know how much that incapacitates you. So if somehow, like, I'm imagining like a Saturday morning cartoon show, if the eye could talk and started like talking smack on the foot, like how like its own powers would be debilitated if the foot's not operating properly. And like you said, this I think this is an analog for marriages, like a marriage that's functioning well, but also the life of the body of Christ. And funny enough, I mean, I think religious orders have tried this sort of thing, but like we couldn't have just like the Dominicans alone, or even like just priests but no lay faithful. Like they all hang together in a beautifully ordered whole. And in some ways, like those religious orders, like who on the surface or like externally speaking, like they're sort of out of the way. So like the Jesuits, for instance, they run like important sort of like renowned universities in the United States. And you could think about like contemplative orders like the Pink Sisters in St. Louis. I forget like the official name of their order. But these women spend, like several hours a day in prayer. But if you talk to a good like a heroic missionary priest, he'll say like the fuel for my ministry are the prayers of religious who are behind the scenes. And like it isn't the patroness of missionary efforts Saint Teresa of Lisieux, the little flower.
Absolutely. And I think about like Dante has Thomas Aquinas complimenting the Franciscans, and then he has St. Francis complimenting the Dominicans. This idea, like you said, of this complementarity. So to end the segment here, but so that's at the macro level of the body of Christ, but it's also true on the micro level of your soul. I think it's important to start to say, you don't find a weakness and go like, well, I'll never be good at that. You don't find a weakness, and even when we're saying this, we're not saying like, oh, well, someone will take care of that. What we're saying is, okay, well, if you're strong, like you have strong interpersonal skills, but that you don't, you're disorderly, right? You don't wake up and make it to places on time. What you have to learn to do is use those interpersonal skills to the benefit of the weakness of like your organizational skills. So use those interpersonal skills to figure out how you can use them for the sake of those weaknesses in organization, and vice versa, right? You're an introvert who doesn't like talking, but goodness gracious, like you really know how to be organized. Use those organizational skills for the sake of, And introversion's not a weakness. That's mean of me to say.
Hey,
but like, let's
on.
say the criminal shyness sort of idea. But you get my point, right? And I think that starts to be what we're getting at. There's upsides and downsides to all sorts of personality traits, skills that you're good at, all of those things. But the question is, when you understand a weakness within yourself, not only do you go find others to help make up for that weakness, but how do you use your strengths for the sake of that weakness in you? And what you'll find, I think, Bud, to wrap it all back around, is you'll end up being a David or a Moses where through the act of grace and through the miracles of God, what people will remember you for were things you thought you needed to work to forget about yourself. And in the grace of God, those become moments of great rejoicing. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Like I said, I knew we were going to bring strength out of the weakness. It was like Michael Jordan, Bud. We kind of got cut from the team, but then we came back. The first segment, we won the national championship with UNC. And then the second one, let's be honest, we won 6 championships with the Bulls. Let's not make this Michael Jordan with the Wizards. Let's finish strong.
Okay. Well, if you want to stay strong in your own spiritual life, you can join us here on Iowa Catholic Radio and pray in the Rosary every day, 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. on air. The Rosary is broadcast. Then 2:55 p.m., the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. You can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere. You
can go to iowacatholicradio.com to check out, well, everything that is involved with Iowa Catholic Radio, but certainly the events. Go to Iowa Catholic Radio. On the drop-down menu, check events, some of those coming up. We got a lot of stuff happening in August. So August 2nd in West Des Moines, First Friday Mass. Join staff and friends of Iowa Catholic Radio Network every first Friday for the celebration of Holy Mass at the Chapel of St. Gabriel the Archangel at Iowa Catholic Radio Studios. August 8th through 18th, Bud, Fair Fever. That's everybody loves the fair. And, you know, I know it's still, everybody's just getting used to summer. That stuff's basically a month away, people. August 8th at the Iowa State Fairgrounds, we'll have Lauren Daigle with special guest blessing offer. From the roof-raising Salvation Mountain to the incredibly beautiful Intimate. Sometimes Daigle is now recognized as a 2-time Grammy, 7-time Billboard Music Award, and 4-time American Music Award winner. A little bit further down the road, September 28th through 29th, on Wells Fargo Arena, we have Christ Our Life Conference. World-class speakers, renowned Catholic exhibitors. You can go to iowacatholicradio.com and click to get tickets. I know everyone is looking forward to that. Speaking of things we look forward to, we hope you look forward to the programming here on Iowa Catholic Radio, whether that be the national feed or local shows like us, The Uncommon Good. And in order to keep that going on, we have to rely on your help because, folks, this ministry is not just the folks you hear on the air. It's not the people behind the mics, behind the boards, or behind the desks alone. It is your ministry as well. We exist because of your time, your talent, and your treasure. Thank you for all the volunteer work you do. Thank you for the prayers, but also thank you very much for the material support. We couldn't do it without you. Please consider donating to Iowa Catholic Radio, 515-223-1150 if you want to call or text and communicate with someone about it. You can donate on iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app. We very much appreciate everybody who's donated, but please consider prayerfully donating so that this can keep going on. iowacatholicradio.com, 515-223-1150. Bud, do you have any weaknesses you're going to work on this week? No, I'm kidding. That's too mean to do.
Well, I hope not to create any weaknesses by blowing off my digits this Independence Day. Usually when guys get to like their mid 40s, they start transitioning to like serious fireworks are the ones that like make bright lights and things. But I'm still like a ladyfingers and pop bottle rockets guy.
I'm glad you're definitively beyond the Snap It guy, No,
I still like Snap Its, and actually Snap Its, they've improved the technology, so some of those sound pretty powerful, and they're fun to throw at people's feet.
So you're like, back in my day, you had to like blow up a black cat in order for something to be loud. These kids these days. In our day, the Snap Its were just like the little like gunpowder rolled up like in a tissue or something. That's true. If you haven't done Snap Its for a couple of years, I highly recommend it. Well, I think I got something to do over the 4th of July weekend. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our family, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.